you. Okay. Okay, so good morning and welcome everyone to today's Stakeholder Series meeting on data sharing and the digital single market. We're very grateful for Microsoft to sponsor this event. I apologize for being a little bit late to open, but we're still waiting for MEP Sandra Ragossi. But we wanted to get started so that we still, and I actually see that the MEP is connecting now. Good morning, Mr. Ragossi. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Sorry for a few minutes late, but there was a lot of traffic.
It's fine. Unfortunately,
it's a good sign.
Well, exactly. I was about to say it shows that we're back into more normal.
Yeah.
Normal post-COVID.
Yeah, but I got used to get in 15 minutes in the office, so I mean, I had lost track of.
Exactly. But in any case, you're here now, so welcome and thank you for joining us. I was just slowly beginning to open the event and introduce the topic and introduce the speakers. So today we have MEP Sandra Ragossi from the Renew Group in the European Parliament and also the rapporteur on IMCO's opinion on the Data Governance Act with us to discuss this very important topic. We have Jeremy Rollinson, Senior Director from Microsoft, And then we have Alexandre Rohr from the CCIA, who's a senior manager there and leading on some of these policy issues. We have asked each panelist to give a short 2 to 3 minute opening statement, but in response to the same question. Do you think that overall the European data strategy sets the right direction for the EU to benefit from the use of data? And we will also be asking that question directly to you, the audience. So my colleague Natalie will be opening a poll shortly. And we would love to hear from you as well. Do you think that it's the right data, the right direction? We'll also be asking this question at the end of the event so that we can see if you have learned anything and if that has actually made you change your mind. And with that, I will hand you the floor, Mr. Gozzi, as the first speaker, to please give your opening remarks. Are we going in the right direction?
Yes, I believe we are. I believe we are. I believe that we need to enrich Europe's best achievement, which is the single market. And I mean, to enrich the single market, we must go towards the direction of shaping a real digital single market, and you cannot have a real digital single market and a real European data economy without a new approach, which includes also new regulation, a new governance on data. So I mean, I think that the choice that was made is the right choice. The aim of building up a single market for data and to design a new European model of data governance. There are a few issues that we should look at in particular. In my view, of course, the first issue is to find a right balance between protecting privacy and facilitating data sharing, which is also to better draw distinction between what is fall within the famous GDPR regulation, data protection regulation, and what falls into the non-personal data approach we are talking about. The second is we need to clarify. I mean, we live in an interdependent and global economy, so it is clear that we need also to make clear how we want to regulate our relationship with third countries. And I think that some form of safeguards are needed. For example, requiring to the user coming from third countries to have a legal representative in the union could be an option. We need also to clarify what do we mean by data intermediaries and data intermediation, which is an essential piece of the picture, but certainly needs, certainly in my view, needs to clarify. It is very interesting to introduce the legal notion of data altruism. Also, this require, which is, I mean, to voluntarily make the data available for the benefit of the general interest of security. This also, it is a new notion. The idea and the legal notion of data altruism is something new for many member states. So we have to work on that, taking into better account the interest of the startup and the small medium enterprise that, you know, for our Renew group is I mean, probably the highest priority when we talk about single market, and also ensuring proper enforcement and compliance, because the best regulation can be totally ineffective if we don't provide the necessary financial and human resources to the authority that must ensure the surveillance on the proper implementation of this new regulation. And last but not least, also ensuring a proper mechanism for redress. In my view, we should also include the possibility of collective redress. So using the legal possibility to promote collective redress. This is my bit for this kickoff.
No, thank you very much. I think a lot of food for thought there, and I'm sure that our panelists will have some views on that as well. But before we dive into that, I will give Jeremy the floor for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Kate. And I'm really happy to be able to have this chance to talk to everyone about this topic. I think the word data sharing captures so many different scenarios, and that's a good thing. On the strategy itself, I think it depends a bit if we're talking about the strategy or the initiatives within the strategy, of course. But we definitely at Microsoft believe that the strategy, is the right approach here. It recognizes a very, very important opportunity and some of the realities around here as it applies to all of the different companies that are going through their own digital transformation, the importance of data to that transformation, and especially the importance of data to leveraging new technologies like artificial intelligence. We've observed, and at Microsoft, we launched over a year ago what we call our open data campaign, which is really aimed at making sure that data access and data sharing and data collaboration is made possible to as wide a set of stakeholders as possible, and that the benefits from increased data analytics and all of the value that data can bring, we want to make sure that is not being concentrated only in the hands of a few companies or a few jurisdictions. This data divide that sometimes is referred to in the context of AI in particular, I think that's something that's real, and data sharing is a very, very good way of taking a more open approach and ensuring that those benefits and access to data are something that a wider group of folks can benefit from. So we think the strategy recognizes that opportunity quite well. We think the strategy also puts in place some ideas with the right premise that a more open approach is something that actually gives others the chance to benefit from these services and these technologies the same way. Now, sharing, again, it captures all of these different scenarios. I like to use the word collaboration, and it's important to remember that within those scenarios, there can be instances where we're opening up data for everyone to reuse under any type of circumstance. And there can also be scenarios where it's just Jeremy sharing data with Alex, or Jeremy sharing data with a closed group, or a closed group sharing data with another closed group. All of those scenarios require different considerations and different tools and even different talent. But at the core, the strategy, I think, recognizes that quite well. I think, an open approach here is incredibly important. Inherent to data sharing is this opportunity to collaborate with the widest set of technologies, the widest set of talent, and the most access to data that you can have. So I think we're very positive of the tone the strategy sets out and the importance of the industrial data in that context. So really anxious to see how more and more of these initiatives roll out. But yeah, I think we're actually pretty happy with where the strategy laid things out and identified the opportunity and some of the tools that we can develop to execute on that.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Alexandra, I'll give you the final word.
Thank you, Kate. I'll try and make it short. First of all, I'd like to thank Aldi for inviting CCA to speak. For those of you who don't know us, CCA is a trade association that represents a wide range of European, US, and Asian companies across the ICT sector. And to the question whether the data strategy is going in the right direction, the short answer is yes. I think we can all agree on this. But I think it's important that the EU ultimately doesn't veer off course midway its journey when we're looking at the Data Governance Act or the forthcoming Data Act, as well as the Data Governance for Public Procurement. That may be another initiative that may be relevant for data sharing as well. Now, for the long answer, I would say what's great about the data strategy is exactly what Jeremy said, the tone and the fact that, up until very recently in Brussels and in the rest of Europe, the debate around data was very much focused on restrictions and probably for the right reasons, because we were then talking about privacy. Now we're moving into a space where we're talking about non-personal data. And now we have, with this strategy, the recognition that a strong recognition, a strong affirmation that with data, you can create economic innovations, data-driven innovations. And I don't just mean economic innovations, I also mean like sort of health research advancements. There's a great deal of collaborations between institutes across Europe, as well as with the outside world. And I think this is the bit that's super important. I think we live at a time where we need more collaboration, particularly on health research, rather than less. And if we look at how, like, the state of, for example, just if we're zeroing on business to business data sharing, there's companies already sharing data, and the majority of companies are acknowledging, even if they're not involved in data sharing, they're acknowledging the importance of data sharing. This is about opening up, business opportunities. And what is interesting is, the Commission actually came up with a study on, what's the landscape of data sharing in Europe. And one of the recommendations of one of the findings of the study is to say, well, actually, European companies could actually share more if they had more certainty around some aspects around revolving around data sharing, like what we would call data ownership rights. We've heard that before, the ability to track the usage of data, and increase certainty about the nature and procedures relating to licensing agreements. And I think that's a space that the EU wants to occupy, and that's a good thing. But I think, just as a closing remark, the EU may be looking at, for example, specific data sharing models and bring about legal certainty for those data sharing models. But there is no one way to do data sharing. Jeremy has mentioned open data. There's a growing open data movement, just like in the open source community. But that's not obviously the only way. You also have data intermediation services like those captures in the Data Governance Act. You have technology services specialized in enabling data sharing, but they're only really just selling the technology rather than the actual data itself or access to that data. You have bilateral agreements. You may have collaborative agreements between industrial players. And I think it's important that we recognize this sort of multiplicity of governance models that's happening. And again, as I said, I think there is a space for the EU to sort of bring about more legal clarity for one or more of those governance frameworks out there. There's more to talk about, but I'll stop here. I've already been too long. Sorry.
Thank you, Alexander. No, I think that's fine. Thank you all for your welcoming, for your opening remarks. And it's good to hear that I think everyone agrees that we're going in the overall right direction. That's also the clear result from the audience poll that we did. 65% believe that it's yes, and 35% believe that it's no. So let's dive into some of the underlying topics and some of the underlying challenges that I think all of the speakers were touching upon, right? Because yes, we all agree on the what, but there are some questions as how do you then actually do it? How do you do it from a business perspective? What are the barriers? And what can you do? What can you do from the political level, right? Because I think this is really what we need to discuss here today. What is it that the political level can do, and where is it that the political level can potentially do more good, do less good than intended? So I wanted to dive a little bit into that, and I think you're all talking a little bit about it, but in different terms. But I think one of the first questions to dive into here and to sort of make it a little bit more concrete as well, if we can dive a little bit more into what is the kind of data that we're talking about, because Mr. Gorsi was also touching on this, right? What's the balance between privacy and data sharing, right? I mean, a lot of this we're talking about non-personal data, but then of course there's the issue of the mixed data sets. So how do we also, in terms of just explaining and informing and educating users so that there is a trust, how do we do that? And I think here as well, to hear some concrete examples from you, Jeremy, and also Alexander, right, as industry, that would be quite helpful, I think, for the audience as well. And really here, I leave it to, I don't want to sort of have a very kind of static, but we always have the same speaking order. I really just invite you all to jump in. But I'll make sure, of course, that you all have a chance to speak. So who would like to dive in here first?
The industry.
Mr. Gorsi, why don't you go? And then Jeremy.
Sure.
I know, I was saying that the industry could go first.
Okay, well then, Jeremy, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different, I mean, I'll come back to something I said earlier and Alex picked up on. You know, there are a lot of different scenarios in this space. And I think the word data sharing, it's very loaded. You know, too often I sometimes think we expect that data sharing means that I just open up all of my data for anyone to have access to and do anything they want with. And there are scenarios where that makes a lot of sense and it is happening, but it's not the full spectrum of where the opportunity here is. So some of those concrete examples, what I mean is there are those instances where government data, when we talk about cities data, you know, that's parking data made available to app developers who can create new services to mitigate, you know, traffic or convenience of knowing where to park in a city, knowing what the weather combinations may be with that. You know, we're using open data in that sense to stimulate smaller applications and improve citizens' lives in cities. You can think about other instances, though, that are much on the other side of the spectrum where you have two competitors. And we have this from our customer segments, particularly in manufacturing contexts, where two industries would be established near a water reservoir, paying for access to that water and for waste back into the reservoir. Neither of them would ever want to share data that might divulge secrets about their cooling needs on their assembly lines and the like, but they would be interested in decreasing their water bill. And with the possibilities that technology can provide for inputs about the data or the needs that they have going into a platform or a third-party intermediary, they can get outputs from that data that benefit everyone. So those competitors aren't necessarily learning or having access to the data about each other, but they are benefiting from the outputs of that data analytics, which means, hey, you know, what you're paying for access to the reservoir could actually be decreased if you were using the outputs from the other manufacturer, which would be more than sufficient for your assembly line purposes. And we've seen customer stories like that, which people start to have the light bulb to go off and say, okay, now I kind of see what's in it for me. I think, you know, one of the reasons we look at that where is the reluctance to data sharing? And you talked about where can policymakers help? You know, if you think of what customers are saying, it's, you know, I'd like to be more open with my data, but I'm unsure of privacy concerns. I'd like to be more open with my data, but I'm concerned about competitive interests. I'm concerned about losing my trade secrets, losing my IP. That's a space where not only more legal certainty could be provided, exactly what type of contract should be permitted there, what type of rights are relevant or not, but also technology where, you know, there are technologies emerging where you can provide, you know, I can provide Alex access to the outputs of data without ever giving him access to the raw data itself. We talk about how valuable data is in this space, but I think we really want to focus on the value of the outcomes, not the data itself. Without the right talent, without the right technologies, you know, data doesn't have that same value, but it's those insights and it's those outcomes that come out from it. And some of those concrete examples that we can, you know, continue to discuss that I think you really see it. And at a societal level, just for a couple of other concrete examples, you know, we've launched a number of open data collaborations over the past year, cooperating with governments, industrial players, researchers, and others, particularly in a COVID context. So if it was the collaboration that we did with the City of London, where you're tapping into sensor data that the city has to measure the effectiveness of COVID response measures, where are populations moving when certain measures are put into place? Are we seeing positive impacts from those measures? And tapping into sensors that are normally used to capture weather or traffic patterns, combining that with additional data sets from hospitals, from the government, from private technology platforms that can process that on a much, much higher level. You know, understanding, well, that measure actually didn't work. People didn't actually start moving any differently, or, oh, wow, we're able to tell that that type of measure really did restrict movement and we saw less spread in this community, et cetera, et cetera. There's been a lot of examples from COVID in particular where that collaboration angle, I think, has been really, really prominent.
Thank you, Jeremy. Mr. Ghosty, what would your contribution be here? I think there was a quite clear ask from Jeremy in terms of what you can do as the policymaker.
What we are doing with the Data Governance Act is to try to regulate exactly this part about which Jeremy was talking about. I mean, we have already an open data directive of June 2019, but that this directive on open data lays down the rules on the reuse of public sector information. We are talking about data that cannot be made available as open data because they include information on individuals or company information. Can be also health, the financial system, whatever. And what we have to see is how to make available this data which are subject to protection legislation on intellectual property, trade secrets, etc., while keeping these fundamental rights. I mean, the issue is, challenge is to find ways to enable knowledge to be extracted from the data while fully preserving, for example, privacy or other rights, which can be individual right or commercial rights. So what we are trying to do, and what the Data Governance Act proposes, is to lay down conditions for use of certain also public data, public sector data, that would allow algorithms to travel to the data and entail privacy preserving technique. It is clear that this must be done in a very secure environment, and this means that there must be a surveillance according to the rule we are working on by the public authorities, or there can be also confidentiality agreements to be signed between the data holders and the user. But I mean, to give you some example of what we are talking about and what would be the advantages, or will be, I hope, the advantages for us as citizens to have a more effective use of data. I think, for example, the benefit we could get from health data. Health data means improving personal treatment, improving healthcare. It may help research to fight against, to fight and cure rare or chronic disease. It's clear that, I mean, we are talking about the most sensitive data maybe, and we have to ensure, I mean, how we extract the data and how this extracted data will be reused for health purposes and research purposes. Think about mobility data. This morning I was a couple of 2-3 minutes late because of traffic, which is coming back also in Brussels. I mean, it is clear that, I mean, if you better use mobility data, you can have a better management of transport, especially of public transport. You can save millions and millions of hours of public transport with a more effective transport management, thanks to the reuse of data concerning mobility in our European space. Think about environmental data and how can be used for a more effective fight against climate change or CO2 or reduction of CO2 emissions. Things about agricultural data and how they could be used to develop more precision farming. And you know that technology goes hand in hand with a more effective agriculture. And last but not least, public administration data to have more reliable statistics. I give you this example, which are the, I would say, the most relevant example, but I think that are also very helpful to better let us better understand what we are talking about and how this new approach could help a better governance and a better society after all. This is what we are talking about, but it is certainly a very delicate approach that we have to pursue, because we are at the juncture of different sphere, of different legal sphere, if you want.
Well, I think exactly, and I think that's, and thank you for providing all of those concrete examples to both of you. I think maybe this goes a little bit to what you were talking about in your introductory remarks as well, Alexandre, that we're talking about such a diversity of types of data, of sectors. Some of it is clearly completely non-personal, but then there can be other sensitivities, as Jeremy was touching upon. Then there's healthcare, where there's a very significant social benefit, but of course we are talking about deeply personal and sensitive data. So how do you then create that legal certainty without creating a one-size-fits-all? And maybe I'll start with you here, Alexandre, because you haven't yet spoken to the questions, and I think this is also a little bit what you're maybe touching upon in your introductory remarks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kate. you know, we talked about health data. That's actually very interesting. Mr. Gozi mentioned, you know, health data is probably the most sensitive data, and rightly so. At the same time, the importance, I think Mr. Gozi recognized the importance of being able to share data with one another and being able to clarify something like a framework for the data sharing, of this particularly highly sensitive data is crucially important. Now, the reality, I think, ultimately is that, for example, if we look at the state of research, health research collaboration, I would point to a study actually, a report from 3 European research organizations that talk about their collaboration, the way they share data with research partners in Europe, but also most importantly with research partners in the United States. I'm sorry, there's a bit of echo. I don't know if it's coming from me.
I don't know whether because I'm experiencing the same difficulty in hearing Alexandre. I don't know whether it's whether the other panelists have the same difficulty.
Okay, it seems fine now. Okay, wonderful. So indeed, so European researchers basically pointed, so they looked at, you know, this is the way we do European research, and we collaborate with international partners. And for that, we need to send data abroad. And the Data Governance Act, when it comes to highly sensitive data, such as health data, covers that bit. Then the DGA does include restrictions on data transfers, on and the potential sort of data localization requirements in there. And I think, you know, if we look at what the European researchers are saying to us, they're having difficulties in conducting today collaboration with international partners in critical health research, like, you know, research in cancer, various forms of cancers, all the way to Alzheimer and so on and so forth. The findings of the study are quite interesting because they're essentially saying, just because of GDPR, we're not even talking about DGA, the legal uncertainty around GDPR and transfer restrictions under GDPR is such that now we have put on hold 40 European, US and European health research projects. And you have a question mark for 5,000 projects ongoing, again, where there is collaboration between European researchers and American researchers. And that's the bit that would be, I mean, unfortunate if then, you know, there's already a great deal of complexity with GDPR data transfer restrictions. I'm just wondering, what does that mean if we add a layer of complexity with the Data Governance Act? Now, I think ultimately on this point, if I'm just focusing on international data transfer aspects here, there is legitimate concerns around, for example, extraterritorial government data access laws out there. But I think a unilateral approach is one answer, but cannot be the only answer. You need to have a consensus. You need to have a discussion with your international partners. Every government is moving in that direction. Every government wants to get more access to data, even if it's not stored within their territory. That includes European governments. The European Union has its own e-evidence proposal, which is kind of like the US Cloud Act. I mean, I'm not even talking about national security laws. I think there needs to be a discussion here, and that's already happening at the OECD level, where you have governments sitting at a table and trying to figure out, like, what are the common principles and norms we can agree on for, you know, and limitations and safeguards for government data access. But I think maybe the DGA, at least the proposal, went a little too far and add a layer of complexity for international data transfers. And that's not helping, ultimately, neither companies nor, I gave the example of health researchers, that's not helping them either in collaborating with partners.
So before I hand the floor to Jeremy and Mr. Goss, in case you have anything you would like to come back, you might well have. I just wanted to let the audience know that I'll be turning to audience questions after this. So if you haven't already been putting your questions in the Q&A, please do. And my colleague Natalie will be feeding them through to me. But Jeremy, Mr. Gossi, do you have any? Because I mean, I think we have to also be, we have to look at this holistically, and we have to see how the different pieces play together. But of course, we also have to be, realistic in terms of how many different things we can fix with one piece of legislation. Do any of you have any thoughts to add, to elaborate?
I make, one thing, coming back to the opening question, Kate, when we think about, does this set the right direction? I think when we're measuring the outputs from the data strategy or any of these instruments, if we agree that the strategy sets the right tone by encouraging data sharing and the way that that can be a great opportunity to leverage the data opportunity to boost digital transformation, we should always be asking, does this proposal, whether it's DGA, Data Act, does it lead to more data sharing, right? We want to encourage data sharing. It would be ironic if the strategy to encourage data sharing resulted in making it harder to share data. If data sharing goes down as a result of the outputs from the data strategy, well, I don't think that would be a successful outcome, right? We want to make sure that we're providing that certainty. We're looking at those reservations that people have around sharing data and addressing them either with technology or with policy or with other ways of doing that. So I would say that is kind of the way that you look at how successful this is. If a few years from now, companies feel more confident sharing data because they're more confident about the legality of doing so, they're more aware of the tools that they can use, they have more tools and technologies to choose from, that'll be a successful outcome. But if things become too complicated, if there's too much ambiguity, if we instill too much fear into doing that, that would be a bad outcome. I think all of this needs to be something that's done responsibly and with trusted models. So I think even the model the Commission puts forward in the DGA is one that can be really appropriate for a lot of scenarios. But there are so many scenarios here. We want to be addressing them where we can at that higher level, even though there's no one size fits all. So we'll talk about things principally like interoperability, legal certainty, clarity on what type of privacy mitigating technologies can be encouraged and should be used, because there are more and more of those emerging. But I think we can always measure the success by how much data sharing are we stimulating. We believe that the most successful companies of the future are going to be those that are more open. And I think we'll start seeing that more and more in the market. We want to make sure those companies have the right access to the widest range of tools and the widest range of talent that they can bring in. Because really inherent to the data sharing opportunity and inherent to collaboration is making sure that we can work cross-border. We can learn from what's been taking place in other jurisdictions. And I think the pandemic has been a really good example of that, where around the world, we were all faced with a similar challenge, creating loads of data around that. It's a great opportunity to share and collaborate on that to drive outcomes that benefit, everyone, rather than just a particular project or a particular scenario.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions coming in from the audience, but before turning to those, Mr. Gossi, I don't know whether you had anything you wanted to say here. You're on mute.
On one hand, we must develop a European approach. We are a big market. 450 million users, potential users. We represent 50–20% of the market for the big tech and the digital giants. So I think that we need a European approach. But it doesn't mean that European approach must be done totally detached from our relation with the rest of the world. There are works being done at OECD level about legal definitions. There are bilateral contact and discussions between the European Commission and some third countries which are interested in the same approach. But I think that we should have the ambition of proposing new models and new standards at global level. And Europe as a standard setter has a pretty good tradition. And I think that we should try to confirm this tradition and develop this approach also in this case. This is my first remark. So of course, and we have new opportunities. I strongly believe that there are ears more open to dialogue and to listen to our ideas over the ocean in Washington. But I do not believe that there can be drastic digital revolution in the regulatory approach from the state. But I think that if we move ahead effectively, we can also help to move the debate in the Congress and the United States, which is in my view, our main and first interlocutor. Also at OECD level, but we have to also work with other, of course, with all the third countries which are in. This is the first thing. The second thing that, I mean, we are talking about this data, European data spaces, to have, I mean, they should allow data from across the EU, both from the public sector and businesses, to be exchanged in a trustworthy manner and at lower cost. And here it is included those notions of confidence and trust, to which Jeremy was referring to. I think that this is also very important. If we want to develop in perspective some tools of a strongly European autonomy in this sector, such as a European cloud, for example, it is clear that, I mean, to have rules which allow the emerging of European data spaces and to allow us not to be totally dependent on the private sector and on the digital giants, I think that's something that is very important for us. And I think that it is something which goes beyond regulation and encompasses geopolitics. And geopolitics today is not only relation with other states, but also relation with all the big actors which play an influence on the global scene. And here, of course, there are also digital giants. After all, if you take the budget of the major tech companies in the world, they already represent an equivalent budget of Netherlands. And Netherlands is the 17th richest country in the world. So, I mean, we are talking about big money and big issues that requires, in my view, also a new strategy in terms of European autonomy from our part.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to some audience questions now. I'm not sure that we'll have time to go through all of them because Mr. Garcia also has to leave us at 10:20 already. But Jeremy and Alexander will be with us until the top of the hour, not the top of the hour, so the half hour. So the first question, I think this is a quite good one. How does one reduce the intrusiveness and, quite frankly, annoyance of the end user being constantly presented with long illegal licensing text, which cannot be reasonably read and comprehended, and opt-in, opt-out pop-ups? So I think here the asker is thinking a little bit about the browser cookies that I'm sure that we all love whenever we visit a website. How do we, if we're talking about data sharing here and we're talking about having, individual data sovereignty, how do we then avoid that this leads to these types of very long text that people, frankly, they don't read and they just, I mean, at least me, I just click. I just want to, get on with whatever it is I'm doing. I don't know who would want to take that one.
Well, I could take it only because I think it relates to policies and legislative files that are actually taking place in parallel to this discussion on the data opportunity. We're talking about privacy rules largely there. And I agree that those pop-ups are incredibly annoying. And listen, there has been a proposal from the European Commission to change that and make that indeed a more by default or a transparent way at the outset for users to look at. The e-privacy regulations currently in trilogue now, and that does have provisions in it which could potentially change that space. I think when we're talking about data sharing, I would pivot a little bit away from that. And that's more about, well, the data that's being collected there, what happens to it? What type of control do I have over it? If somebody else wanted to tap into all of those different data sets that are being created from those choices that users are made, under what conditions could that data be made available? In those instances, we're talking about personal data, you naturally would be much more restrictive on the reuse thereof. But to stop there, I think, watch the privacy negotiations closely. That may be a very timely answer to that question. But yeah, I can agree that there's certainly annoying pop-ups.
Any other responses to that? Otherwise, I'm actually going to give the floor to Mr. Gossi, just in case that he has any closing remarks before he has to leave, and then we can certainly try to still get through some more questions with Jeremy and Alexandra. Mr. Gossi, would you like to leave us with some words of wisdom?
I have to leave you because while I was talking to you, they just confirmed that I can take my second dose of my vaccine at 10:30. So I mean, I don't want to miss it, and this is why I leave you a few minutes before. I would just remind few figures, because we are talking about a lot about the legal dimension. Let's talk also about our economic interest on data access and data reuse. According to the figures we dispose of, we are talking about benefit which goes beyond the 1 to 2.5% of European GDP. The new measure under DGA could increase the annual economic value of data sharing by up to between 7 and 11 billion by 2028. And these new rules will have a wider impact also on the EU economy and society as a whole. For example, still according to the expert, 1.3 trillion could be the increase in productivity in manufacturing through Internet of Things data by 2027. And we could get also 120 billion of savings per year in the EU health sector. I haven't started from this dimension, but this dimension is fundamental part of our strategy. And this dimension is what also we mean in concrete terms when we say we need a European data economy and we need a European approach to data sharing, because we're talking about a strong economic interest, productive interest that in our view should always take into account also the specific needs of startups and SMEs. That's I think that this figure was very important to nurture our debate, Kate.
No, thank you very much for sharing those, and I think and thank you also for leaving us with those, because I think they are really important. And as Jeremy said as well, as we're diving into the weeds, let's always keep them at the back of our minds, right? What is the overall objective? More data sharing. Why? Because of all of those economic, those societal benefits. And then we need to continuously measure up progress against whether we're achieving those objectives. So with that, I will thank you very much for joining us, and good luck with your second shot.
Thank you. I go.
All right. So with that, let's see which other questions we have. I mean, we have another question which I think is very interesting, but like the previous one, it does probably relate a little bit more to adjacent regulation, but how do we ensure the safety and the privacy of data, in particular healthcare data, considering the increase in actions such as cyber attacks, right? So yes, we want more sharing. Sharing is great, but of course we are also constantly increasing the threat surface. So how do we make sure that we prevent that? And do we need to? I mean, is that something that we just need to do from industry side, or is there even policy action that needs to be complemented there?
I'm happy to take a quick stab at it. I think it's a very good question. And I think especially with highly sensitive data sets like that, there's a number of things that you have to keep in mind. It is the protocols that you would apply to access to that data, the environments in which you'd be processing that data. That I think we even see quite a bit of in the DGA, and we can likely see more of that to come in the Data Act. I think there needs to be a sufficient threshold for saying, processing of those data sets and access to those data sets is naturally going to be a bit more restricted and needs to meet a higher bar than non-personal data sets where no one could be identified with much less sensitive uses. You could even think of non-personal data that would be highly sensitive and also need to be processed in a secure environment. I don't think of many scenarios where we would want to make data available for reuse around, troop movements or nuclear power plant blueprints, but you could imagine access to such data would want to be much, much more in a secured environment with a limited set of access to a limited set of players. The other thing that could bring in would be around the technology side, where there are techniques and technologies that are emerging that I think are kind of exciting to follow. If we think of differential privacy, for example, where you inject a bit of false data into a data set to create noise there that sacrifices a bit of accuracy, but benefits privacy tremendously. So it's impossible to eventually be able to re-identify anyone within that data set. You can still get some very accurate and good outcomes from that are sufficient for the project you're launching potentially, while maintaining levels of privacy that reassure anyone who's involved in that project. So looking at some of those technologies that have emerged, the platforms, the different research methods that have been brought into play, I think you can hit it from the technology side, and then from the regulatory side, some of those requirements around where the bar needs to be for secure environments, where the bar would need to be for the security protocols that need to be put in place for highly sensitive data. I think you hit it on both sides.
Thanks, Jeremy. Alexander, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I mean, look, on ensuring the privacy of data, in particular highly sensitive data, I think we have at least part of an established framework with GDPR. We've had privacy laws in Europe for 25 years now. And now we're discussing the e-privacy regulation that's reforming the e-privacy directive that touches upon some sensitive data as well, and how a service provider can access and use device information. So that's still sort of pending, and that's probably a question that we may want to ask also lawmakers in the context of e-privacy. How do you ensure the privacy of data, but in a way that doesn't unnecessarily restrict either the provision of service that, for example, a user has requested, or the sharing of that data, because we're here to talk about the sharing of data. So that's, and I think, as Jeremy said, ultimately, it's great you have the laws, but at the end of the day, to make it a reality, right, when it comes to ensuring the privacy and security of data, we're really talking about technologies. And Jeremy highlighted one way of doing so. There may be other ways. For example, like you may store data, you may splinter the data in different bits and pieces and spread that out across the world in different regions. It's important, of course, to make sure that you still have sort of resiliency, that not if you have a problem with one infrastructure where the data is hosted, the whole data set is not actually compromised, and you make copy of that, but again, you split that out across the world, and then whoever is going to access the data, be it, like, for example, a cloud customer, would be basically holding the key in order to put all this data all together, and only he or she would be able to do so, right? That's also another way to do so. I mean, there are a bunch of obfuscation techniques to make sure that, companies' roles is, they wouldn't have any customers if they couldn't guarantee that they couldn't prevent unauthorized access, right? That would be a bit of a problem. So, but it's a fair point, and I think it's ensuring the safety and privacy of data, and, well, let's just call it the preservation of the integrity of the data and the confidentiality of the data. That's ultimately the privacy and security question, both on legal and practical technology side of things.
Okay, so I'm really sorry, but I don't think we're going to have time to take. There were still a couple of questions, so apologies to those who asked those questions, but we're just not going to have the time to go through with them. As I said at the beginning, we will relaunch the poll, right, to see if there's been any changes from what people have heard and learned today. And then I will give each of you, literally, it's going to be 1 minute, any kind of closing remarks, what is the key takeaway that you would like the audience to leave with today? And Alexander, why don't you go first this time, and then Jeremy will have the last word.
Yeah, I think it's been said many times. Ultimately, I mean, today we were talking about like the data strategy and how we increase data sharing, right? So I think in a few years' time, we'll have to assess whether, to what extent actually companies have actually, or not just companies, but also public authorities, have actually shared have actually shared data with one another. And I think, again, as I said in preliminary remarks, there's room for the EU to clarify. That doesn't necessarily mean restrict, because, I mean, there may be room for restrictions in certain governance models, for certain data sharing governance models, but not to the point that it would deter data holders from sharing their data, or data users to use certain processing technologies because they would be unlawful under the DGA, under that particular governance framework. So I think, we want to keep that in mind, like sort of be outcome focused as far as this. And I think there's a lot